Coming up, it's a week of big departures and a double heaping helping of high drama. It's a week for taking to the streets and for holding nothing back.
And whoever came up with this, I mean, my God, have you been blind for the last few months?
Y'all are wrong. Y'all are wrong.
You don't rule this committee.
Week in Review is made possible through the generous support of Dave and Jamie Cummings, Bob and Marlise Gorley, Smithfield Foods, Haas and Wilkerson Insurance, the Courtney S. Turner Charitable Trust, John H. Mize and Bank of America N.A. co-trustees, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Nick Haynes, and we're delighted to have you with us on this journey through the news of our week, pouring through the week's top local news stories with wisdom and pithy insights from KCTV5 News reporter Caroline Sweeney, from The Call senior writer Eric Wesson, keeping track of the news from behind a microphone at KCMO Talk Radio, Pete Mundo, and from the pages of your Kansas City Star, Dave Helling. Now, we just picked a new mayor. Now Kansas City looking for a new city manager. Troy Schulte abruptly announcing this week he's heading out the door. He will retire after 10 years of being essentially the man responsible for implementing all of the decisions of the city council in our metro's largest city. He says he's retiring. He has no plans other than relieving his wife, he says, of running the shuttles to his kids' practices and activities. Is there more to it than that, Eric Wesson?
No, I think he's had a good run. 10 years is a long time for a city manager, so I think he's had a good run. And everybody knew it was coming, they just didn't know when. I think it was pretty abrupt. Just send everybody a letter, say, hey, I'm out of here in February. But he's had a good run.
He was making $220,000 a year. Not bad coin for that job. But after 10 years, is it enough, or is there something more to the story, Dave?
Well, first of all, the next city manager will make more than $220,000 a year. That's actually a little underpaid for a city the size of Kansas City. But Eric's basically right. The decision by Troy Schulte to leave office was his own, but no one tried to talk him into staying, because there is growing disappointment, and I've written a column about this, from the mayor primarily, but other members of the council, that Troy Schulte's leadership on three important issues has fallen short of what they want. On the airport, there's a great concern that there are too many complaints about what's going on out there and that there aren't enough Kansas Cityans working on the project yet. The water department is conceived to be in trouble in Kansas City. The bills are high, the money is going through, and yet maybe the people down there need to be changed. And then economic development, the battle over the downtown building known as Strata, and Nick played a role in this. The debt that Troy has accumulated. For all of those reasons, Quinton Lucas made it pretty clear that he would not be upset if Troy Schulte moved on, and Troy Schulte did that.
What does this mean then for Quinton Lucas now and what he is trying to achieve as mayor, Pete?
Well, when he was running, he was away from the glitz and glamour that built up downtown that Sly James takes credit for, but it felt like a lot of the city had been left behind, right? A lot of that credit goes to Mayor James and then also to Troy Schulte, but as a result, they also have to pay the political price for what did not work in other parts of town. Jolie Justice ultimately paid that price. Now you have Troy Schulte paying that price. It means that Quinton Lucas is going to find somebody who's going to be more in line of what he wants to get done. A lot of the things that Dave Helling just pointed out are going to be the priorities of what Quinton Lucas wants in his next city manager.
Caroline, I was always a little nervous about starting the show with this because some people will think this is an absolutely huge deal and other people will go, yawn, yawn, yawn. Who cares about the city manager? Everyone sees the role that the city manager even plays in government in Kansas City, Missouri.
Yeah, I think what we've seen, especially with the relationship between Mayor Sly James and with Troy Schulte, is that Sly James and the city council are the mind, they're the head, they have these ideas, and Troy Schulte's the neck. He executes it, he turns the head where he wants it to go. He's really the boots on the ground when it comes to the ideas coming out of the city council chambers. But I'll say February is a long time off, so the letter that Eric was referring to may have been abrupt, but it's not like, hey, I'm out tomorrow. It's I'm leaving at the end of my contract.
Okay, and who fills then Troy Schulte's shoes? During the campaign, there were words like, hey, Scott Wagner, who was a candidate, the former city councilman, he would be a city manager choice. Oh, Catherine Shields, also on the city council. Are those favored candidates now?
Not necessarily. There will be an interim city manager if necessary. It's almost certain that they won't be able to pick someone by the time Troy Schulte leaves, in part because Quentin Lucas has talked about a nationwide search. And Kansas City, by the way, Nick, has a habit of sort of hiring someone from inside, then outside, then inside, then outside. And if that pattern holds, then yes, they will find somebody from another part of the country to come into Kansas City. But just briefly, I'm amazed that Troy Schulte decided to stay until February 29th, in part because it's going to be difficult for him just as a lame duck to administer the city, and partly because it's the winter, and he's going to take the blame for snowfalls and potholes and all that kind of stuff at a time when he's leaving City Hall. You would have thought he might have moved it up.
Is there a favored candidate for this position?
There's a rumor and scuttle, of course, they already know who they're going to get, of course, but there's a city manager that was in Gardner, Kansas,
Right,
a black
I've heard
woman. I've heard her name be mentioned quite a few times, and of course, at first during the campaign, it was Catherine Shields, but I think she's locked in as the finance director.
And for
or
what it's
chair.
worth, Catherine Shields, when I raised this with her several weeks ago, she laughed. She literally laughed. That's not in her plan.
Well, a lot of
No,
people
it's
do
not.
things like that. It's been a week of high-profile departures. Also making the news, Royals manager Ned Yost calling it quit. He announces he's leaving the ball club after 10 years. Hey, wait a moment. Kansas City is thinking of building a downtown ballpark. Yost knows lots about baseball and managing a complex organization. Is it possible he's freeing himself up, Pete?
Yeah, I think it was time, right? You got new, you got new ownership. The team
Okay.
stinks. I mean, it's kind of how baseball works. Is this Ned Yost's fault? No. A baseball manager is the most inefficient's the wrong word, but can have, I think, the least amount of impact of any coach in major professional sports. So it was a clean break. It's time to move on, and I don't think there's any ill will there at all.
Would he be leaving if they didn't just lose 100 games, Caroline?
You know, Ned Yost is saying that he's leaving because they're on the upswing of the rebuilding part of the Royals ball club. But as Royals fans, we all know sometimes that can take decades to get us back to a World Series. But I will say, even if he wasn't thinking about city manager, we have seen a lot of crossover between baseball and politics in this town,
course we
especially
have.
with Frank White.
Hasn't worked too well, but
So, you know, it's never outside the realm of possibilities.
There are thousands of places you can learn about the pros and cons of impeaching a sitting president of the United States, but there are very few that track what your local politicians will do. Will they or won't they? Is it coming down to partisan lines in Kansas and Missouri, or are some bucking the trend, Dave Helling?
Well, it is partisan now. It's partisan here and across the country. That was true, by the way, when Richard Nixon was impeached. It was basically a Republican-Democratic thing until the very end, and then the dam broke when some of the tapes became public. And that may happen here, it may not happen here. It puts Sharice Davids, in my view, in a very difficult position because, and her position on impeachment, as we know, evolved over about a 72-hour period, in part because she's getting pressure from the left to be more aggressive about impeachment, and yet there's no way that the people on the right in that district are going to support anything that looks like impeachment, and she's tried to thread that needle, and I don't think very successfully, frankly. I think a lot of people have said, you know, we need to hear more from her about this.
Well,
Emanuel Cleaver,
yes.
of course, did move forward and endorse the impeachment inquiry.
Early in the week, Sharice Davids puts out a statement and doesn't even use the impeachment
Correct.
word whatsoever. But she does then later in the week do that and becomes much more emphatic about it. But is it possible that she actually had new information at that point in time, or was it simply, as Dave Helling points out, Pete Mundo, that she was being clobbered by those in her own party who were unhappy by her?
To Dave's point, she's just trying to walk the perfect political tightrope, which she's been trying to do since she won the seat, which is fine. I mean, I think she's played her cards pretty well, considering, you know, where the registered voters are in the district that are Republican voters. But I don't think this is as big of a deal for her reelection chances, because whoever comes out of the Republican primary, whether it's Sarah Hart Weir or Amanda Atkins, Donald Trump was not going to be a big part of this district's debate process between Sharice Davids and whoever the nominee is, because he's not popular in the district anyway. So neither of those candidates were going to latch on to Donald Trump. So I don't think this will play as big of a role as some people think.
Except that, just briefly, Sharice Davids will make Donald Trump the issue. And since Donald Trump is on the ballot, whether the Republican nominee wants to be associated with the president or not, that's going to happen. That's a bit of the dilemma in the 3rd district.
But when she ran the first time, she had a platform. And I think with the Donald Trump situation, it's kind of getting her away from her platform, healthcare, education, and the things that were popular in that district. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting that Trump had raised like $1 million in 3 hours in the midst of all of this, and a lot of it came from people that would be supporting Sharice Davis. And I thought that was extremely interesting.
An impeachment inquiry, of course, is only the start of a very long process, a process that ultimately would require 2/3 of the United States Senate voting to convict the president for him to be removed from office. That would mean 20 Republican senators having to vote with every Democratic member. We have 4 senators representing our bi-state, all Republicans. Is there any evidence to suggest any of them would vote for the president's removal, Caroline Sweeney?
No. There's no evidence at this point. This is a very partisan issue. And I will say, we were talking to Josh Hawley about this kind of at the beginning of the rumblings that the judiciary was thinking about starting this process and outlining what that would look like. And he emphatically said there are other things we need to be focused on. And I think to the benefit of all of the elected officials that I've spoken to, they're all saying we would much rather be focusing on something else. But Josh Hawley said our communities are awash with meth, and then he pivoted to the southern border. So he's emphatic that this is not something he's interested in.
Eric mentioned, for instance, the president raising quite a bit of money right after the impeachment inquiry was announced. How is this energizing other candidates, even for local races? You know, the United States Senate race in Kansas, does this help Chris Kobach? Does he bring in a lot more money because of this?
I don't think he brings in more money because of this. I mean, Chris is going to have to, you got Congressman right now, Roger Marshall's out there with about $1.5 million. He's by far the front runner when it comes to money. Everybody's going to be chasing him, at least on that front. I don't think Chris Kobach or anybody statewide is going to raise a ton of money off of this issue. It's going to be what's their ground game like and where's the funding coming from?
I don't think they're going to raise a lot of money statewide, but I think this could definitely help candidates like Steve Watkins, who are desperate to keep their seat and really focused on trying to hit the base that they weren't necessarily making happy in the first election. So if this is something that Steve Watkins can pivot off of, I think it could benefit him.
I think Steve Watkins is just going to kind of hope to God he hangs on. I think that's Steve Watkins.
And he's
right
the
now.
Kansas 2nd District Congressman based out of Topeka. Yeah. Any other comments on this before we
I would
move on,
just say
Dave
that absent impeachment and conviction, which is at this point almost an impossibility, Donald Trump will be on the ballot in 2020. He will be the issue. Do you want to reelect this man or not reelect him? All candidates in both parties will have to address that issue. It's unavoidable for both Sharice Davids and whoever her opponent happens to be.
And to get back to Caroline's point, the Senate leader will be the one that decides on if there's any conversation in the Senate about this. And Mitch McConnell hasn't leaned toward even having a conversation about it. So I think it might be just a lot of hoopla. The House might do something, but I don't think the Senate will.
2,000 workers at Kansas City's General Motors Fairfax plant are still out on strike for a second straight week. This week, they get a high-profile visit from the man who wants to be the nation's next president.
I knew the reason why General Motors was in trouble wasn't because of the UAW, it's because of bad management decisions they made along the way.
Workers have shut down 33 manufacturing plants in 9 states across the U.S., as well as 22 parts distribution warehouses. So why did Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden choose Kansas City to make his stand, Caroline?
I have to say, when I heard he was coming to Kansas City, I thought it was a strange choice, considering that Kansas and Missouri aren't considered to be heavy early states, and that Michigan, the Democrats lost Michigan in 2016. On the same day as Joe Biden was here, Elizabeth Warren was in Michigan. She was playing to those voters' strengths. I didn't get press guidance from Biden's people until about 4:30 on Saturday afternoon, which is really late for a stop like this. And then when I saw that he was going to a fundraising effort in St. Louis, I had to think really this was more of a stop of convenience, something he needed to do in a very specific window because other Democratic candidates were doing the same thing.
You know, a lot of the UA...
Plus, Nick, you think back a couple of days before that or a little while before that, Congressman Cleaver endorsed him. So that might have been a payback with Cleaver to come in and kind of get some support here in Kansas City as well. Missouri's considered a swing state now for some strange reason. But
a lot of Republicans, and certainly the UAW, has expressed concern that the reason why they're out on strike is not just about pay, but about a management that has decided to close plants here and take them overseas, which has been a big, strong point of President Trump. Why is it, though, that the parade of political figures coming out of the GM Fairfax plant in Kansas City, Kansas, have been completely Democrats, from Governor Laura Kelly to 20 state representatives and senators who are all Democrats.
Because unlike 50, 60 years ago, I don't think that today pro-worker or pro-American job means pro-union. I think that was the case back then, but I think the union has kind of been neutered to the point where it's not nearly as valuable or as important as it was. So there are ways to be pro-American worker, as Donald Trump and other Republicans would say, that have nothing to do with the unions.
UAW workers were the only ones, by the way, that in Kansas City taking to the streets in protest over the weekend. Climate activists took over the Country Club Plaza. At one point, Quinton Lucas joined the march, claiming combating climate change and promoting sustainability is one of his top priorities. Other than advocating, though, for free buses, which we discussed last week, what else has Mayor Lucas done since taking office that demonstrates that?
Yeah, not a great deal. I mean, there's not a lot that a local government, other than working on mass transit. Kansas City has passed Clean Planet initiatives over the years and sort of committed themselves to doing that, and cleaner buses and bike lanes as opposed to cars. All of that work can be done. But the challenge of global climate change, of course, is much bigger than any one municipality, so there hasn't been a lot involved. But climate change is an issue, particularly for younger voters who feel like it is here and they're worried about it, as those demonstrations showed us. And therefore, politicians, I think, increasingly will try to capture that younger vote based on this issue.
I still just think this is a loud minority of people where, if you're sitting in the city, you have a top 5 homicide rate. Any time that Quinton Lucas is spending on climate change, which, as Dave points out, whatever you think about it, a local municipality is not going to do a lot on that front, is time taken away from trying to solve a violent homicide issue that is top 5 in the country.
Is that why he barely ever mentioned the environment when he was running for mayor?
Yeah, it didn't get popular until these young people start talking about it. But I agree. But I agree with what was just said, but I kind of disagree. I think he needs to let the violent crime conversation take place with the chief of police. The chief of police is an expert. He knows that. I don't like seeing the mayor talking about, I know he has to for whatever reasons, but I don't like seeing him talk about it because people will remember what he says, and then when it doesn't work, they'll come back and use it against him. So I think he needs to refer those conversations to the chief of police, and the energy issue, I think he needs to refer that to somebody that's a lot more in depth than he is about it.
Another rally planned for the Country Club Plaza this weekend, this time for teen suicide prevention. It comes as a new report in Kansas shows that suicides are up 50% in just 1 year. This Tuesday night at 7, KCPT responds with a special hour-long broadcast on teen suicide.
The first time the suicide idea popped into my head was in middle school.
I'm being bullied for my autism. I wrote a goodbye note when I was 7 years old.
I think one of the biggest things parents can do is not be afraid to directly ask their child, are you thinking of suicide?
You are the co-founder, the owner of Nick and Jake's restaurant, hugely successful. You lose your own son to suicide, but that's not supposed to happen to people like you, right?
Wasn't in the cards, no.
I'll have friends who will be like, oh, did you see that kid? He went to the counseling office. That means he probably has mental health issues. Like, oh, how weird.
And you can see Kids in Crisis coming up Tuesday night at 7 right here on KCPT. It was a differing issue in the campaign for mayor. Candidate Quinton Lucas claiming he would pardon anyone charged with municipal pot possession charges. That left many residents feeling penalties for having pot were about to be eliminated. So some got downright angry this week when the City Council failed to pass a new ordinance decriminalizing the possession of up to 100 grams of marijuana.
We're going to vote to get y'all out. This is not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Y'all are wrong. Y'all are wrong.
Don't rule this committee.
The measure has now been removed from consideration for at least another month. If there was an issue I predicted would be a slam dunk for this new administration, this was it. What was the hang-up? Eric?
The chief of police connected marijuana sales to violent crime. And that's an issue, and that's something that nobody ever thought about. And 100 grams of marijuana is quite a bit of marijuana for your own personal use. Usually, if you have that much, it's probably distribution.
The 100 grams, about 3.5 ounces.
Yeah.
And the prosecutor in Jackson County has said, in essence, for those cases, she's not particularly worried about decriminalizing it in Kansas City because she doesn't think she has the time or energy to prosecute them. And so we've recommended actually that this ordinance pass. But the marijuana laws in our region are so confusing and so misaligned that the public, my guess is, Nick, is baffled about really what the approach is to the drug, you know, at courthouses, in police stations, at City Hall. If you decriminalize 100 grams in Kansas City, that includes Cass and Platte counties. If you're caught with 100 grams in those counties, it's a felony.
So even if you're a Kansas City resident and they made these laws, you could still be prosecuted in those other places.
So something that you might think is legal, you know, at 31st and McGee is suddenly, when you go north of the river, not acceptable. So we've also talked about the need to sort of standardize this stuff so we understand completely.
But back to Eric's point about it was really the concerns of the police. They said there were 10 homicides directly linked, as they claimed, directly related to marijuana use, and that's not something we've been paying enough attention to. Have we been moving too far, Pete Mundo? Too quickly without understanding what the consequences are?
I don't think so. I just think that the 100 number, to both of my colleagues' points, is a distribution number. I mean, that's not that's not an individual or a couple of roommates number, and that's where, you know, it's a fine line. You don't know where to draw it. It's a gray area, but certainly that's a very high number.
And we've forgotten half of our audience that lives in Kansas, where they're basically doing very little with regards to this issue. However, Caroline, if I may say, you were just in Colorado yourself, reporting for KCTV5 on people now abandoning Kansas to go there to take advantage of medical marijuana.
Yes, I am focusing on families and people who have left Kansas to go to Colorado. Anchor Brad Stevens is going to be looking at people who are trying to figure out what to do if they live on the Kansas-Missouri border. And even when I went into Colorado, remember, they also have legal recreational marijuana, but there are completely different statutes and regulations when it comes to medicinal cannabis, recreational cannabis. So even with states that have deregulation decriminalization, it's not an easy road.
Is the head of Jackson County government about to solve all your problems? At least the problems of those thousands of angry homeowners who say they may be forced out of their houses because of astronomical property appraisals. Don't worry, says Frank White. He's proposing a $3 million property tax cut for residents across the board. If the measure is adopted, he says nearly 200,000 taxpayers would pay less to Jackson County this year than they did last year. Have angry homeowners now returned their pitchforks to their garden sheds and removed the blood pressure cups from their arms, Eric?
No. I think Crystal Williams said that amounts to about $6 to $12 or something like that. I think he's got some serious issues, and with the Kansas City School District not lowering their levy this week, that still puts the ball right back at square one.
But didn't you say on this program, though, Dave, that people really didn't have much to be worried about because each of the taxing jurisdictions, like the school district and the city and the libraries, could just roll back their tax levies, and this is not happening this week.
So make sure what I said on this show. Because yesterday, unnoticed by everyone, Kansas City did roll back its levy, in part because it's required to under the Hancock Amendment, and other jurisdictions are doing the same. The exception is the Kansas City, Missouri School District, which is not bound by Hancock. They refused to roll back their levy yesterday, and they will share the blame when people start getting their tax bills in November and December, because that decision results in roughly, on average, a 24% increase in taxes for the average homeowner in Kansas City, Missouri. That's not
But they say they need the money, and when we think about things like pre-K, kindergarten, they're going to be expanding that, and so why should we surrender that funding?
But they didn't ask voters for it, and they've basically said to voters, we don't really care what you want to do, we're going to do what we're doing here.
You know how you know this was a horrible political decision by Frank White? When you release it on a Sunday afternoon after a Chiefs game, and then you skip town for Nashville that week. I mean, goodness gracious, Nick.
When we put together a show like this one, you have to be selective in what topics you can get to in a half an hour. What was the biggest story we missed? Is the NCAA about to wreak havoc at KU, or is this latest news of serious violations in the school's basketball program a story to sell more papers? A second vaping death in Kansas. Now, area school districts want to sue the manufacturers. Royals pitcher Danny Duffy being praised for speaking out as he reveals his silent war against depression, anxiety, and systemic bullying in the clubhouse.
Take naps. Naps are okay.
Sleep-deprived students rejoice. Emporia State becomes the second school in the nation to install napping pods on campus, and you get 2 hours free every month. And get ready to learn a new word as Kansas City flirts with parklets. Several options for you to consider. Was it one of those or something completely different, Eric?
Channel 41 not renewing the contract of D. Jackson in the middle of his discrimination lawsuit. It looks like retaliation.
Fortunately, we don't have somebody from Channel 41 on the program this week, only from KCTV5. Your story that we should have added to the program but missed?
I'm really excited about the parklet idea. I think we've really focused on, the revitalization around downtown, but more green space, the better, in my opinion.
Dave.
The KU story is huge. The allegations against the basketball program are very serious. They involve the FBI, and Bill Self, who is a secular hero in our region, is really on a hot seat.
It's been a heavy show. I like the sports angle from Dave. Let's go on a positive note. Kansas State's in the top 25. Big game in Stillwater this weekend.
Yes.
Between the Chiefs,
yes.
KU, K-State. It's a football state again.
Go
Even
Cats.
KU's playing okay.
All righty, that is our Week in Review. And by the way, Caroline Sweeney, a huge K-State fan, of course, from the studios of KCTV5 News. Caroline Sweeney, thank you for being with us. And 6 to 10 weekday mornings on KCMO Talk Radio. Pete Mundo, fresh actually from our nation's capital, also doing broadcasts from there this week. From the Call newspaper, Eric Wesson, thank you. And from the pages of your Kansas City Star, Dave Helling. I'm Nick Haynes. From all of us here at KCPT, thanks for spending part of your weekend with us.